Mein Name ist Adam Kerpel-Fronius und ich bin Historiker und wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter der Stiftung Denkmal für die ermordeten Juden Europas. Und keine Angst, ich werde gar nicht so viel reden, aber ich möchte Cameron trotzdem noch vorstellen, weil wir uns schon relativ lange kennen. Und zwar war das erste Mal, dass Sie zusammengearbeitet haben, im Jahr 2012, 2013, wo Sie eine Wanderausstellung uns präsentiert haben über das Vernichtungslager Kulmhof-Chelmno. Und später haben wir noch zusammengearbeitet bei einem ebenfalls super spannenden Projekt über die Außenlager von Auschwitz. I'm happy to give the mic to Cameron Munro, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, all. My name is Cameron Munro. I am going to give the lecture tonight. So I started the research on poison gas about approximately 10 years ago, beginning with Kulmhof, the Vernichtungslager in Kulmhof, moving on to the Nazis' mercy killing program of the mentally and physically disabled, Auschwitz, Action Reinhardt camps, and sundry other actions. So the first few years I worked on the research, and it left me with a lot of unanswered questions as to how the Nazis came to adopt poison gas, gas chambers, and actually the actions themselves, which led me on to study the chemistry of the gases they actually used, which were carbon monoxide and exhaust gas, and hydrogen cyanide, Zyklon B. And that answered some of my questions, not all. This led me on to look at and research the pre-1939 research that had been done on these gases, which answered some more of my questions, but not all, which led me on to why, in the first place, these gases were researched. And this led me down some strange paths, which I will talk about tonight, which you might think are not connected to the Nazis and their use of poison gas in mass extermination, such areas as the Industrial Revolution, stray cats and dogs, capital punishment. But all will be revealed. So, if you were to question populations of the world as to their view of the Nazis' ideology, and their mass extermination techniques, some of the answers you might get are unique, came out of nowhere, unexplainable, particularly German, evil, Daniel Goldhagen, Hitler's willing executioners, detached from history, and to go down to the granular level, the Nazis, at the basic level, invented gas chambers, poison gas, and killing people with gas chambers and poison gas. We can immediately disavow that. That is not correct. Even in ancient times, people used gas chambers and poison gas for suicide, for mass killing, and they also used the poison gas on the battlefields. There are many examples. To give one, in 216 BC, Hannibal, General Hannibal of Carthage, who was at war with the Roman Empire during the Second Punic War, he induced the survivors of the city of New Syria out of the city into the local Roman baths, where he had them gassed with vapor, probably carbon monoxide from burning charcoal. So, the Nazis certainly did not invent gas chambers or the use of poison gas. So, if we move to modern times, the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain in the mid-1700s. It's not a big bang affair. It happens over a few years. There are stages in the development of the Industrial Revolution. For example, 1764, James Watt, a fellow Scotsman, invents the steam engine. So, as the Industrial Revolution takes off, there is a migration of people from the countryside to existing cities like London, but also to new industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, Glasgow, etc., etc. There is also the beginning of a middle class, wealthy middle class, who get wealthy off industrialization, building factories, making goods and selling them. So, obviously, I think everybody would know the Industrial Revolution was not without its side effects. So we see, in all of these big cities, nothing is planned. There is basically little or no local government. People just move there and houses spring up under the worst of conditions, and prostitution is rife, infanticide is rife, crime is rife. There are stray cats and dogs everywhere. It is not a pretty sight. By the 1830s, it's got so bad in Great Britain that it is estimated something like 10% of the population is destitute and living in these cities. Now, in the Middle Ages, already in England, there was something called the Poor Laws, which was locally provided help for the worst off. By the 1830s, the whole system is bankrupt because there are so many destitute that somehow it needs to be reformed. And in 1834, in the British Parliament, they reformed the Poor Laws. The workhouse had already existed, but it took a new form now. It needed to pay. So in terms of the workhouse, what I'm talking about, everybody knows Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist is about, well, part of it is about the workhouse. Now, if I describe the workhouse is a place you go when you have nothing, you can't feed or clothe yourself. Women and children are separated from the men in different locations. They are not allowed to mix, even if they are of the same family. People are forced to wear uniforms. The people in the workhouse must work to gain any subsistence. They are not allowed to talk during work hours. If they break the rules, they are punished, beatings, etc. The mortality rates in the workhouse are absolutely appalling. There's epidemics, disease, people don't get enough food. Personally, one of my great-grandfathers was born in the workhouse in 1891. When I looked at this, in terms of the origins of the concentration camp, so obviously the Nazis used the concentration camp. And then some people say the British invented the concentration camp during the Boer War. I would say not. I would say the workhouse is the concentration camp. It has all the elements of a concentration camp. Okay. In terms of the conditions of the poorest 10% of the population, somewhere between 2 and 3 million, this is a cartoon from a journal of the time, and it pretty much shows how some members of the establishment viewed those poorest of people. When I looked at it and saw this picture, it also reminded me of possibly how and certainly the Nazis viewed the Jews. This is not a very nice picture. Okay. Friedrich Engels, he of Engels and Marx fame, Communist Manifesto and all those areas. In the 1840s, Engels is in Great Britain. And he is interested in what is happening with the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain and how it's affecting what he calls the working class. And in 1845, he publishes a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England. And he particularly looked at Glasgow, Whitechapel and Bethnal Green in London, which is East London. And I have one quote I took, which I'll leave you to read. So when I read this sort of reminded me of descriptions of the Jewish ghettos in Nazi-occupied Poland. I've seen descriptions that are very similar. Engels based his theories on his time in England and what he saw in terms of the conditions of the working class arising out of the Industrial Revolution. He also, as well as being a very clever man, in the same book, warns Germany that if Germany adopts the Industrial Revolution, it will have a revolution. The power of the Industrial Revolution are hydrocarbons. So hydrocarbons are wood, oil obviously, not used then, but wood, oil, coal, and other materials that contain carbon. If you burn a hydrocarbon fully, so there's full combustion, it produces carbon monoxide, water, and energy. If you don't fully combust the hydrocarbon, it also produces carbon monoxide. Now, carbon monoxide is a deadly gas. Less than 1% in a confined space for 2 minutes will kill you. So, the power of the Industrial Revolution are the burning of hydrocarbons. So that is synthetic gases. So synthetic gases are invented in the late 1790s. And this is what we know as gas being piped from the local gas station to light the streets or heat homes or fuel homes, etc. So in the big cities, pollution is being pumped out on an unbelievable scale by the 1840s. It is killing a lot of people because of the carbon monoxide content. So in Great Britain, there is already in the 1840s a Royal Commission to investigate what can be done about carbon monoxide and the poisoning of the environment. This is not a new thing. This is a very old thing, goes back to at least the 1840s. And actually already in the 1840s, the understanding of carbon monoxide, its physiological and physiological and psychological effects were already known. Okay. Every coin has two sides, as we know. So we have the appalling conditions resulting from the Industrial Revolution. We have a new middle class who got rich off the Industrial Revolution, and we obviously have the landed gentry who are still around. So some people are appalled by the conditions of the Industrial Revolution. And there are also some residual leftovers from the Enlightenment, for example, slavery. So in 1807, Britain abolishes the purchase of slaves directly from Africa in the British Empire. In 1823, William Wilberforce sets up the Anti-Slavery Society, and in 1833, they finally get it abolished in the British Empire. But there are all sorts of progressive movements beginning. So 1817, Elizabeth Fry sets up an organization to improve the prison conditions of women. 1822 already, you have the foundation of the Royal Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals. In 1837, you have the first vegetarian society in the modern world. It's not German, it's actually British, founded in 1837. In 1838, You have the temperance movement, which begins in America, then moves over to England. And many, many more. Royal Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Children, etc., etc., etc. As I mentioned already, the research on carbon monoxide is already going on in the 1830s, 1840s. And this research continues right up till 1939 and goes on until this day. The extent of the research is so extensive because carbon monoxide is still, and was then even more so, the biggest accidental killer of people. So, and in these times, it was even worse because carbon monoxide was everywhere. It's in factories, it's in the home, it's in the workplace, steelworks, coal mines, etc., etc. So the extent of that research by 1939 is almost complete. In 1939, they know as much about carbon monoxide in terms of its physiological effects on humans than they do today. They don't actually know much today, more today than they did then. I already mentioned one of the side effects of the Industrial Revolution is the creation of these huge, sprawling, unplanned, uncontrolled cities. Rabies, hydrophobia, I've forgotten the name in German. Tollwut, excuse me. Tollwut has been around since time immemorial. And even today, people have a morbid fear of rabies. It's not a very pleasant way to die. It wasn't so much of a problem when you didn't have these huge, sprawling cities. But it becomes a real problem in the big industrial cities because stray cats and dogs multiply massively. They spread rabies and they bite people. This is a cartoon, actually, a British cartoon that shows a rabid dog, the black animal on the right, and all the people are panicking. This is how rabies is seen. So all these cities start to employ people to catch and destroy stray dogs and cats. The traditional methods were beating them to death in the street, shooting them, drowning them, and many other non-humane ways. This is a cartoon that represents the method in New York right up until the 1890s. So in New York, they used to have a roundup of strays just before the summer. And what they used to do was they used to take all the strays down to the dog pound, which is next to the Hudson River, put them in a big crate, dump the crates in the Hudson River, and drown them. That was the method. So, we move on to Sir Dr. Benjamin Ward Richardson, a progressive of his time. He is a medical doctor. He is involved in the Vegetarian Society. He writes papers already in the 1850s, 1860s about how smoking is bad for your health. This is not a new thing either. He's interested in the hygiene in cities and all these good things. He's a true progressive. And just to remind the under-30s, progressiveness is not new. This has existed for a long time. It's not something that's been created in the last 10 or 15 years. Now, Dr. Richardson, from the early 1850s, started experimenting with small-scale gas chambers to humanely kill the ill and old cats and dogs of his friends. And he's already experimenting from 1850, and he starts to use carbon monoxide gas from 1853, 1854, and the carbon monoxide is generated from burning charcoal. He is a member of the Royal Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals. He believes the methods that are being used, beating to death in the street, drowning, etc., are not humane. And he is looking for a humane method, and he thinks that method is gas and carbon monoxide. He also experiments with electrocution. So that is the use of electrocution for killing animals, particularly in slaughterhouses where the methods are seen as completely inhumane. So already from the 1850s, there's a lot of research going on as to the use of poison gas, the use of electrocution as alternative humane methods to kill stray cats and dogs. In the early 1880s, Dr. Richardson is tasked by the Battersea Dogs Home in London, which is founded in its original form in the 1860s. I believe this is the first dogs home in the world, and it's certainly very famous, and it still exists today in London. And he is tasked with designing a large-scale gas chamber for the Battersea Dogs Home, because by this time the Battersea Dogs Home has been given the job of looking after and dealing with stray cats and dogs. That means finding homes for the ones that can. It means killing the ones that can't. And he is tasked with designing a gas chamber that can kill up to 200 stray dogs at a time. Dr. Richardson, as well as being a progressive, was an early, what we might call, chemical engineer. So he worked with gas and he worked with engineering and technology to come up with this solution. And basically this gas chamber he builds and designs at Battersea is based on his 30 years of experience since the early 1850s when he starts to experiment with a small-scale gas chamber. In 1884, he gives a lecture at the Royal Society of Arts. Now, the Royal Society of Arts, which still exists today, was founded in 1754, and its purpose is to encourage new ideas, innovation, and also generally the arts. So in 1884, Dr. Richardson gives a lecture at the RSA entitled "On the Painless Extinction of Life in the Lower Animals." This was also published as a pamphlet, which is, I think it's 22 pages, and describes in great detail not just the technology of the gas chamber he built, but also all the experiments he did with the different gases and all the problems faced when building and using a gas chamber using carbon monoxide. When I first read the paper, I couldn't believe it. I thought this was some sort of paper that had been written by or used by the Nazis when they're contemplating using poison gas. No, it is written by Dr. Richardson. This is a sketch of his original gas chamber, and this is the gas chamber with a sliding door. It's very basic. You basically put the stray dogs in a cage, roll them into the gas chamber. They are killed, you roll them out. You get the idea. And this is the cage. He also, during the lecture, goes through all the different gases that you could use. And what are the pros and the cons of using those gases? And he finally settles on carbon monoxide generated from burning charcoal. But, and this was another area that was interest to me, if you look forward to 1940, the beginning of the Nazi mercy-killing program of the mentally and physically disabled, you see a lot in the post-war testimonies, for example, from Karl Brandt, about how this was the most humane of methods. It was interesting for me to discover that according to Dr. Richardson, just using carbon monoxide was not humane. So actually under Dr. Richardson's method for stray cats and dogs, he gave them an anesthetic before the application of the carbon monoxide so they wouldn't suffer any symptoms. And obviously in this time, anesthetics were starting to be used in hospitals. And he was using chloroform. So the first stage under Dr. Richardson's method was to use chloroform to put you gently to sleep, then apply the deadly carbon monoxide so you wouldn't suffer any of the physiological or psychological issues associated with carbon monoxide poison. The Nazis didn't do that, obviously. I do apologize in advance. This is a bit graphic. This is a photograph from Battersea in a British newspaper, which shows one of the crates with strays about to be rolled into the gas chamber. This is them coming out, having been gassed. Unless you read the newspapers of the time, this was seen as a humane way to treat stray cats and dogs. So it's a different world, it's a different environment, it's a different time. So there was just public descriptions about how great this method was. You could actually go as a private citizen to Battersea and see the whole operation if you wanted to, just as a normal person. Okay. What fascinated me as well, the Nazis used gas fans in Kulmhof, in the Soviet Union with the Einsatzgruppe, and in a few other sundry places like Mauthausen. Everybody believes, I also believed, I think, when I started off my research, the Nazis invented the gas fan. They did not. Already in the early 1880s, Dr. Richardson has worked it out and come to the conclusion, sometimes you will not be able to bring the stray cats and dogs to the dogs' home to be killed. Sometimes you have to take the mechanism to them. And he designed, effectively, a gas fan. Okay, it's hand-pushed, but it has the same mechanism that basically designed for the large-scale gas chamber. So this, and he called it a portable lethal chamber, but it is a gas fan. And this used to be wheeled around the streets of London to stray cats and dogs, and those stray cats and dogs would be killed in this, to all intents and purposes, gas fan. Okay. Dr. Richardson's son took over what was by then a business. And he founded the Lethal Chamber Company, which is a company in London that built gas chambers for killing strays. And these would be sold all around the world. This is a sales flyer for what was called the Richardson Lethal Chamber. Now, if you look closely, and this is most important, the words that we see used by the Nazis, painless death, painless extinction, etc., etc. These are not invented by the Nazis either. These words are already being used in the 19th century, as we see here, painless extinction of lower animal life. Those are the sort of words the Nazis did and would use. This is very interesting. Battersea, by the 1880s, are killing more than 20,000 stray cats and dogs a year. Initially, what they do with the bodies, it's always a problem what to do with the bodies. They put them on a train, or trains, send them out to the countryside where they are burned on large pyres. After some time, the countryside doesn't want this anymore. It's not a very pleasant sight, etc., etc., so Battersea is left with a problem. What to do with the bodies of the dead stray cats and dogs? So, 1870s is the beginning of the cremation movement. That is, rather than burying people, you cremate them. It's more hygienic, etc., etc. It begins in Italy, but quickly comes to the UK, Germany, America. So then there is a whole beginning of a innovation and technology around building crematoria. Already in the 1880s, Battersea says, oh, that's the solution. So they build, and this is a drawing of the first crematoria in Battersea. So they already, I believe they are the first, come up with the idea, the most efficient way of exterminating, in this case, stray cats and dogs, gas them, and have close by the crematoria where you can immediately burn the bodies. This, again, is not some Nazi invention. This is technology, and this thought process is already existing in the 19th century. This is maybe the most interesting photograph. This comes from a British newspaper. Obviously, by the 1900s, the technology of cremation, crematories, and gas chambers has moved on. This is a photograph. Unfortunately, it's not the best because it comes from a newspaper, of the rebuilt gas chamber and crematoria in Battersea for killing stray cats and dogs. And it is highly technical, actually much more technical than what the Nazis built in Auschwitz-Birkenau. They still use the cage concept, so the stray cats and dogs are put in the cages and rolled into the gas chambers, which are the two objects on the right. The floor is sloped, so it's easier to push down the cages into the gas chamber. And they have the crematoria right next to the gas chambers, so they can immediately pull out the cages and they put the carcasses of the stray cats and dogs straight into the crematoria. Now, if I'd showed you that without mentioning that this was Battersea Dogs Home, you might think this picture comes from the Nazi period. I thought about whether I should put this in. Unfortunately, I could only include a small part of the research I did, because I've only got an hour and a quarter. But I thought I should put it in, because it is pretty shocking. In 1898, a typical English spinster of the time, who was a cat lover, was a lady called Kate Cording. And she got together with some of her friends to set about saving the stray cats of London. So they were a private organization. I think eventually they did get some money from the RSPCA, but they were pretty much private. And this was just a group of middle-aged spinster ladies. They used to go around London with big fishing nets, catching stray cats and trying to find homes for them. The problem was there were so many stray cats that they couldn't find homes for very many of them. So the research I've done so far, between 1898 and 1913, I believe when Kate Cording died, I think she died in 1913, they caught somewhere in the region of 450,000 cats. They gassed more than 400,000 cats. In their premises, they had, and this is a picture actually from a British newspaper, of a cat being gassed. Again, this is seen as a humane thing. There's no public discussion and outrage. This is seen as a humane thing. And these are just some spinster, typical English spinster ladies. They are not technicians. They're not some great intellectuals. They don't know a lot about engineering or anything else. They just think they're doing the right thing. And they gas between them, it is estimated, somewhere in excess of 400,000 cats. Once I did all this research, it put the context of how the Nazis came to and why they used poison gas, etc., sort of in perspective. Because everybody thinks, this is all Nazi invention. It took some great amount of brain power to come up with the ideas, etc., etc. No. These are spinster ladies in London. These are not some highly trained technical people. So it completely changed my view in terms of how I viewed what the Nazis did. Okay. It's probably a generalism, but I'll say it anyway. Many ideas originate in Great Britain, even the computer, World Wide Web, etc. They are all taken up by our American friends and developed, and they make a great product out of it. The same happened with stray cats and dogs and how they are treated. So America also adopts the same methods. But they take them to another level. So in this case, this is a drawing from an American newspaper of a gas chamber for stray cats and dogs in a particular police district. And they decide using and burning charcoal isn't very efficient, and it's a bit dirty. Let's just use an easier method. We'll take the synthetic gas supply, which is lighting the streets and is heating and cooking for people's homes. They connect up the, guess what? The local gas supply to the gas chamber. Synthetic gas, depending on the type of synthetic gas, has very high concentrations of carbon dioxide. So it's very efficient, it's very clean. Another police district decided to do something different. I think this picture comes from the early 1930s. They decide to build a small gas chamber in the garage of the dog pound. And they say, why bother with a synthetic gas supply or anything else? All we'll do is connect up the gas chamber to the exhaust pipe of the pound car. We'll run the pound car. It will pump exhaust gas into the gas chamber. Depending how you run the car, for how long, and the size of the engine, etc., this can generate a very high concentration of carbon monoxide. It's not a very nice way to die because of all the other constituents of exhaust gas. But that's their solution. This is another newspaper photograph from another police department in another state. They take an even simpler method. Let's make it the most efficient. Let's kill the stray cats and dogs on the way back to the dog pound after we've captured them. So guess what? They take Dr. Richardson's idea and develop it a stage further. They build a gas trailer. You put the stray cat and dog into the back of the gas trailer. When the car starts to move, you connect up the exhaust pipe to the gas trailer, and the stray cat and dog is killed. Again, the headlines tell you all. This is not seen as some barbaric event. It's seen as humane, and people are not really interested. And I've never seen any research done in Germany. Actually, not in England. I had to do it myself, but also not in Germany in relation to what I've been talking about in terms of stray cats and dogs. But what I did find, this is from an American newspaper. I did talk about the fact Dr. Richardson was looking at electrocution and using gas as more humane methods of killing. And there was a lot of experimentation going on. I believe in the 1890s, New York was the first state to adopt the electric chair. And it hadn't been used on strays before that. But what is interesting is there is a 100% crossover between the treatment of stray cats and dogs and capital punishment. So, and we'll talk about capital punishment later, but in any case, electrocution as a killing method is first adopted in the States, electric chair, 1890s, New York, and then people start to discuss and think, maybe this is a more humane method than gas for killing stray cats and dogs. So they take the technology that's been developed for killing people, and they apply it to stray cats and dogs. And this is a photograph from the Berlin Dogs Home at Langwitz, just outside Berlin. They also used and experimented with gas, prussic acid tablets, and many other things. They came to the conclusion that electrocution was the most humane, and that this picture comes from the 1920s. That's actually a picture of a dog being electrocuted. Okay. So a slight diversion now. I want to talk about some of the theory. Thomas Malthus was a minister of the church and professor of economics, as you would be in those times. And he wrote a very important paper, which was published in 1798, which is called an essay on the principles of population. This is a quote, very important quote from the paper. I'll leave you to read that for a few seconds. So, the work that Malthus did is still applicable today. These concepts are still talked about. Is the population growing too fast? Do we have enough resources to support the population, etc., etc.? what is interesting, this work that Malthus did, which is still of relevance today, and proper science, economics. In 1839, there was an anonymous paper published in England called On the Possibility of Limiting Populousness, which took the ideas of Malthus and came to different conclusions in terms of what could be done to limit the population. This is a quote from the publication. Again, I'll leave you to read it. What this paper was suggesting to solve the population problem, especially the problem of the destitute and the poor, was to limit the number of children for the poorest to 2, and any children more than 2 would be taken to places where they would be gassed. And this is a description of how it was foreseen. When I read this, I've seen very similar things from the Nazi mercy-killing program. Now, this caused some stir, as you would imagine. This is 1839, not 1939. In 1839, this caused some stir. There was some discussion because there was no name put to the paper. It was anonymous. And there was a public outcry, and there was public discussion, and one minister went to prison because he accused, guess who? The Poor Law Commissioners of being behind it. And there was a trial. But I just wanted to show this, to show you, even in 1839, the ideas that the Nazis subsequently took up are already being discussed. I wouldn't say this was widespread, but they were being discussed. So, the 19th century is the century of Great Britain. It is the century of Industrial Revolution. It is the century of empire. It is the century of Great Britain being by far the wealthiest country in the world. It is the century of science, new ideas, innovation, modernity, and most of this is coming out of Great Britain, as it would, because the Industrial Revolution starts in Great Britain, long time before it gets anywhere else. In Germany, the Industrial Revolution doesn't really start to get any traction until the 1830s and the 1840s. This is 80 years after it begins in Great Britain. So there's a lot of scientific research going on in Great Britain, and this gets mixed up with a number of factors. Charles Darwin writes his famous paper. A contemporary of Charles Darwin called Thomas Huxley, who's a biologist, he is interested in the differences between and the explanations for the superiority of the white race over, for example, the black race or the Asian race. And he propounds the theory that the British, obviously, are the best of the white race, and then you've got the rest of the white race, and they are superior to the other races of the world. Sir Francis Galton, who is the cousin of Charles Darwin, he is interested already in the 1860s in the decline of intelligence. What he means by that is the poor and the uneducated are breeding too quickly, and the more educated parts of society and their effect on society is being reduced. In 1883, he coins the term eugenics. Eugenics is a strict definition from the Greek, I think, is good in birth. So this just means you are born healthy, you are born with a good mind, etc., etc. All of this begins in Great Britain. It is also associated with the fact by the late 19th century, Great Britain believes they are the chosen ones. They are put on this earth to spread their culture and their superiority around the world. There are many other investigations and side effects going on. What to do with these 3 million destitute? So there are ideas, contraception becomes a topic. Forcible sterilization becomes a topic. This is not some Nazi invention. Forcible sterilization of the mentally and physically disabled never passes law in England over Great Britain, but it does pass in America, which always take the ideas from the British and develop them in a more radical or full way. So in 1907, in Indiana, the state of Indiana, they introduced the first forcible sterilization law, I believe, in the world, and certainly in modern times. Britain is also the center of discussion about suicide, euthanasia, and mercy killing. Britain is seen in the 19th century as the home of suicide. People talk about suicide, they talk about legalizing suicide, they talk about the obligation to commit suicide if you are not well, if you're not fit, and all the rest of it. And from the 1870s, 1880s, they're already talking about euthanasia, which again comes from the Greek and means good in death. That discussion also leads on to what I call mercy killing, which is the involuntary killing of the mentally and physically disabled. And it's very important to differentiate between euthanasia and mercy killing, because even in the 1870s, 1880s in Britain, there is a differentiation. Euthanasia is voluntary suicide, as we would call it. So the history books that talk about euthanasia in terms of the Nazis have got it wrong. The technical term, even then, was mercy killing for the involuntary killing of the mentally and physically disabled. They even differentiated it then. Again, in Germany, there's the view that this is all down to Binding and Hoch in their book published in 1920, Die Freigabe des Lebens und Wesensleben. And this is where the Nazis' ideas come from in relation to killing the mentally and physically disabled. That's not true either. These discussions have been going on for 50 years already, originally in Britain and then in the States. So again, this is not some Nazi invention, it's not even a German invention, the ideas. As another aside, I now want to talk a bit about globalization. There's lots of parts to this, the work I've done, but they all lead to the same conclusion, so bear with me. Globalization, what do I mean by that? That is global trade, as it was then. So in the 18th century, with the British Empire, with the development of the Industrial Revolution, you see a globalization on a big scale. So that's ships taking goods to one country and bringing them back and all that good stuff. The plague, not very well known, but the plague still exists in the 19th century. And there are so many movements of ships around the world. Countries like Britain, America, Germany start to become afraid of importing the plague. So they begin to look at ways as to how to prevent that. Now, in the Middle Ages, it used to be done, I think, in Venice. They used to force the ships to sit offshore for a certain period of time to make sure they didn't have the plague. In the 19th century, where we're talking about money, the Industrial Revolution, pure capitalism, this is not really an option. So they start looking at using poison gas. And the Royal Navy and also other navies have been using sulfur dioxide for a long time in terms of disinfecting ships, killing rats, rodents, etc., carriers of plague. The problem with sulfur dioxide is it damages goods. So another solution had to be found. They built a tug that generated carbon monoxide, and they used to pump the carbon monoxide into the holds of the ships to kill the rats, basically what they were worried about. The other obvious gas to use, there are basically two asphyxiating gases. One is carbon monoxide, the other one is hydrogen cyanide. Those are the two. So, the problem with hydrogen cyanide, it's in gaseous form, and the pre-1920s, they didn't really have a clean and safe way to actually deliver it. During the First World War, and before, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, led by Fritz Haber, started investigating the use of poison gas in chemical warfare. It's already happening before the First World War, but during the war it really takes off. They also, as part of their research, start looking at products that could be used for disinfestation of people and clothes. Because one problem in the First World War, you had so many people in confined spaces that typhus became a problem, and typhus is spread by lice in clothes. So they started to look at ways of, as well as products that could be used for disinfestation of ships, what to do about people. And some members of his team at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, who were busily working on chemical weapons and gas masks and all the rest of it, they started looking at disinfestation. And then I think in 1922, they patented Zyklon B. Now, Zyklon B is a hydrogen cyanide-based product. The difference is it was actually produced in 3 different forms, but it's produced in a form that's easier, that is portable. What I mean by that is easily transported. Because this is a deadly gas, you certainly don't want any problems. The second thing they did was, because like carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide has little or no smell. Therefore, if you're exposed to carbon monoxide or hydrogen cyanide, you don't get any warning, and you will die. So they also decided to put in warning substances, such that if you're exposed to the product, you would know about it before you die and you could leave. And they come up with the Zyklon B product, which is patented, I think, in 1922. But this research comes out of what the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute is doing, Fritz Haber in particular, in relation to the German chemical weapons program. So it's patented in 1922, and then it becomes the disinfection and disinfestation product of choice. So companies are set up in many countries. There's one in Britain, there's one in America, there's another in Australia, and they distribute Zyklon B. And it's used for many things: disinfecting warehouses, disinfecting homes, disinfecting ships. This is an advert from an American newspaper, and it uses particularly interesting words: guaranteed in 4 hours, your home cleaned of all vermin in 4 hours by Zyklon B, the perfect fumigant. Typical American advert. This is another picture of actually in a warehouse, Zyklon B being applied, and it comes in canisters. This is a particularly interesting photograph. This is an advert by Auer, who are a gas mask producer in Germany. And this is a picture of, obviously, Zyklon B having been used to kill rodents in a warehouse. And this is a post-result photograph. When I saw this, it reminded me of a Nazi propaganda film from November 1940 called Der ewige Jude. Because in this film, the Nazis equate the Jews to rats. That is the whole concept. And when I saw this picture, it completely reminded me of that. So we move forward to the Second World War. So the First World War saw the first mass-scale fighting, but this primarily involved soldiers. In the Second World War, we see something completely different: the mass movements and control and confinement of people in concentration camps, in transit camps, in all sorts of camps. And typhus, by this time, and not the plague, typhus is the real fear. And to get rid of typhus, you need to kill the lice in clothes, and obviously in the hair parts of the body. So you see a massive industry in building disinfestation chambers in local towns and cities, in concentration camps, in transit camps, for the army, for the navy, for everybody. Okay, have I got time? Yes. I only talk about a very small part of my research today, but I want to tell you one story, because I think it's relevant. The history of Auschwitz-Birkenau. In the official history books, it says, in the summer of 1941, Eichmann comes to Auschwitz to speak to Höss, to tell him that Himmler has decided that Auschwitz-Birkenau will be the center of the Holocaust in terms of the Western European Jews. This is based on one testimony, and this is Rudolf Höss. Rudolf Höss, who was a commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau, was a notorious exaggerator. And I can show from the research I did, and it becomes obvious once you understand disinfection, etc., that probably, and that's what I say, guess who are in Auschwitz in the summer of 1941? Tesch and Stabenow. Tesch and Stabenow are the distributor for Zyklon B east of the Elbe. That includes Auschwitz-Birkenau. Why are they in Auschwitz-Birkenau? Because at this time, only authorized persons trained in the use of Zyklon B were allowed to use Zyklon B. And Auschwitz, like all the other concentration camps, had a problem. People in confined spaces under terrible conditions. This is typhus. And actually, if you look at it, many of the camps, concentration camps, had a problem with typhus during the war. If I remember correctly, for example, Neuengamme was closed off for 4 months because of typhus, and they were afraid of it spreading amongst the population. So, Tesch and Stabenow are in Auschwitz in the summer of 41 to delouse the barracks with Zyklon B. They had been originally in Auschwitz just before the opening of the camp in 1940 and did the same job. Now, the standard procedure was that they would leave whatever the remnants of the Zyklon B they took with them with the camp or the other entity that was using it. So there were cans left over in Auschwitz. Now, the more likely explanation for what happened in Auschwitz was it was seen by SS officers at Auschwitz, who at this point in time are starting to receive Soviet POWs selected from the POW camps and who are to be killed because they are commissars seen as a threat to the Nazi regime. They are sent to the concentration camps to be killed. And in many camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, they are shot. In Auschwitz, something different happens. Obviously, they begin shooting them, but somebody sees what Tesch and Stabenow are doing. And it's not a great leap of knowledge to say, could we apply that to people? So the most likely explanation of what happened in Auschwitz is Tesch and Stabenow are there in summer of 41, delousing the barracks of Auschwitz, and they are asked by whoever, might well have been Höss's deputy, can this be used on people? And then there is not what I would, it's certainly not a scientific experiment. Then you get the first gassing in the bunker of Block 11 in Auschwitz. But Höss's story also doesn't make sense because the first exterminations of Jews in Birkenau on a large scale occur in March 1942 in the Little Red House. And Höss also says in his testimony that he and Eichmann identified the Little Red House in the summer of 41. That doesn't make sense. Based on my research, because I've also looked at how you build a gas chamber, etc., if you convert a building, you could do it in a week. You don't need 6-9 months. So what were they doing? It doesn't add up. My alternative theory is this was not pre-planned. One of the SS officers, probably Hearst's deputy, saw what Tesch and Stabenow were doing and said, that looks interesting. The other support for this, they also did something similar in Mauthausen, who also got Russian POWs, and they also decided to use Zyklon B, which is a further support. But anyway, that wasn't for this lecture, but maybe for the next one. Okay, understand. So another part of this, capital punishment, which I already mentioned. In the 19th century, every country has their own method. In Germany, depending on the state, they have the axe or the sword. In France, they have Mrs. Guillotine, or whatever the term is. In the UK, it's hanging. In the States, it depends on the states. Some use firing squad, some use hanging. And as well as public discussion on the humanity of killing stray cats and dogs, guess what? There is discussion on what is the most humane way to perform capital punishment. Already, at the time of Dr. Richardson, there are discussions about using the same technique that was used for killing stray cats and dogs to kill prisoners condemned to death. Dr. Richardson is absolutely appalled by this. He is as a progressive, he is totally against capital punishment, and he hates the idea of his method being used for killing prisoners. All through the mid to late and into the 20th century, there are continual discussions about what is a humane death. So, for example, in relation to both capital punishment and stray cats and dogs, at some points, poison gas, hydrogen cyanide, is seen as the most humane. Other points, it's electrocution. Some states, countries adopt one, and others the others. But it is interesting to note the crossover between the treatment of stray cats and dogs and humans. These are the same conversation. Okay. As always, in the US, the subject having already been discussed for 30 or 40 years, finally in 1922, Nevada passes a law to make poison gas an approved method for capital punishment. And this is a drawing from a newspaper of the time. 1924, the first killing of a condemned prisoner, a Chinese immigrant called Ji Zhong, and he's put to death with hydrogen cyanide. But again, there's some interesting background to this. Nevada looked at using Zyklon B. They dismissed it because it is not a humane way of killing. Why isn't it a humane way of killing? Because Zyklon B, as I already mentioned, includes a warning substance that basically causes your eyes to water, your throat, etc. It is there to, in the extreme, to make sure you know the gas is there. But it is not a very humane way to die. So they dismiss Zyklon B and decide to generate the hydrogen cyanide in a different way. It's also interesting to note, no European country, apart from one, adopts poison gas as the method of capital punishment. That one country is Lithuania, who adopted it in the 1930s. No other country adopts it. In fact, the Europeans react with shock and horror at the barbarity of the Americans using poison gas for capital punishment. Why? The most likely answer is chemical weapons used during the First World War, which came as a great shock to the world that they had been used, and the barbaric effect on people. So obviously the Americans were slightly less exposed to that than the British, the French, the Germans. In Britain, France, and Germany, the Americans were seen as barbaric for using poison gas. All of this subject has some link to chemical weapons. I already talked about the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute researching chemical weapons. In April 1915, at Second Ypres in Belgium, there was the first mass use of poison gas by the Germans against French colonial troops, and they used chlorine gas in gas canisters. Out of this, all of the countries start to develop chemical weapons. The research on chemical weapons becomes a whole industry. Out of this comes an industry for gas masks. If you have a gas mask, you need to test it. This is a photograph from the First World War, British, I think, soldiers, having just been through a gas chamber where they wear the gas mask and are exposed to the gas to get them used to being in the presence of poison gas. Obviously, they didn't use hydrogen cyanide or carbon monoxide. They used something like tear gas, which is not deadly, but gives you some of the effects and the feeling of being exposed to gas. By the 1930s, everybody is convinced the next war will be a war of chemical weapons on civilians. Everybody is paranoid. By the mid-30s, all countries are mass-producing gas masks, which they distribute to their populations at different points. As we already discussed, coming out of the First World War and the use of gas is the gas mask industry. If you get a gas mask, you need to know how to use it, otherwise it's a waste of time. If you've never put it on, and you're exposed to gas and you're desperately trying to put it on, that's not going to work very well. So gas chambers appear all over Europe. These are not gas chambers for killing people, they are gas chambers for testing gas masks and getting people used to gas. So in Great Britain, for example, every city and town has at least one gas chamber where the local population, be it the emergency services or the civilian population, can go and test the gas mask. But there is a problem. What to do about the remote areas of Great Britain, where the transport isn't so good, it's not economical to build a gas chamber. Okay, the British say, we need a portable gas chamber. So they build, in 1936, 40 gas vans. This is a photograph from an American newspaper from 1939 that shows Scottish soldiers, as you can see from the kilts, with gas masks, heading into the gas van to test their gas mask. Again, the Nazis did not invent gas vans. So, it was actually my colleague, Herr Pullman, who coined this phrase. But by the 1930s, you have what is called a culture of gas, be it chemical weapons, be it exposure to carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide generated from the synthetic gas supply is the favored method of suicide. Especially in Germany in the 20s and 30s, the suicide rates are huge. After the First World War, the Wall Street crash, etc., etc. What do people do? They disconnect the gas pipe in their flat or their house and use it effectively to kill themselves. It is so bad in Berlin, actually by the 30s, there are at least 10 attempted suicides a day in Berlin using poison gas, and the emergency services have to start carrying oxygen tanks. Oxygen being one way to recover people when you've been subject to carbon monoxide poisoning. You have the mass ownership of cars. What do cars generate from burning oil and petrol? Exhaust, which contains carbon monoxide. So there are massive public information campaigns in all the different countries saying, don't start your engine of your car in your garage with the doors and windows shut, and certainly don't fall asleep. So all of this is going on. And as always, you always get the quacks. So a big industry grew up in, obviously correct in some cases, but there are also a lot of quacks around. And this is an advert for Munyon's Life Chamber, where you could go into the chamber and be exposed to a certain gas and it would cure all your problems. So, I'm just about on time, I think. Okay, conclusions. Okay. Firstly, I would say, in my opinion, that the Nazis, their ideology, their methods, their killing methods, etc., need to be put in the context of American and British experience of modernity in the 19th and early 20th century. That is obvious to me from my research. Secondly, hopefully I've shown it through the research tonight. I have a lot more, but what I'm able to show tonight, that many ideas, methods, killing methods, etc., adopted by the Nazis were actually not Nazi inventions. They weren't even German. A lot of them came from the liberal democracies of Britain and America. Thirdly, Friedrich Engels, I believe, was correct when he said in his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, which he published in 1845, that if Germany adopted the Industrial Revolution, revolution would come to Germany. In my opinion, the Nazis can be seen as some sort of revolution, and it could also be seen as something predictable, as in what Engels was predicting in 1845, except obviously Engels couldn't envisage the extremities of the Nazis and the extermination programs and all the rest of it. But I see some connection there. Fourth, in my opinion, Raoul Hilberg is probably the most important historian of the Holocaust. And he very eloquently described the processes and stages the Nazis went through in terms of getting to the final solution of the Jews, the Holocaust. Stage one, the Jews are excluded from economic life. No innovation is required. This has been done through the centuries in different countries. Stage two, the Jews should be marked with a star or some other mark that separates them. Again, the Nazis did not need to innovate. This had been done in the Middle Ages and all through time. Stage three, the Jews need to be segregated physically, placed in ghettos. Again, the Nazis did not need to innovate because this had been done through the centuries. Now, Hilberg argues, and I would disagree with him based on what I've been researching. Hilberg says in stage four, what to do with the Jews. And the Nazis come to the conclusion, we will kill them. Now, Hilberg says, at this stage, for the first time in relation to the Nazi treatment of the Jews and the final solution, they were forced to innovate. I believe now, based on my research, no innovation was required by the Nazis. All of the technology, all of the ideas, all of the methods have been existing for a long time. Everybody knows about them. They are in all countries. So I would disagree humbly with Hilberg on that. A fourth point. Many people believe everything is understood about the Nazis, about their ideology, about their methods, about their extermination programs. And actually, there's very little new to be researched and discovered. And obviously, quite rightly, things have moved on to research about memorialization, etc., etc. I would argue, based on my research, there is still much to learn about the Nazis, where they came from, their ideas, and their methods. Lastly, I was speaking to a Berlin journalist a few days ago. I had a very interesting conversation with him, and I was describing my research and what I would talk about tonight. And he said something very interesting, which I found interesting. He said, no German could give that lecture because they would be accused of being somehow a Nazi sympathizer, etc., etc. And I find that quite interesting. And yeah, I probably agree with him. Obviously, I'm not German. I don't live in Germany. I don't even live in Brexit Britain. I live in another country. So I'm completely independent. But what I would say on this, I think my impression in Germany is anything that is seen as not 100% guilt of the Germans in terms of what happened during the Nazi period as seen as somehow reducing the shame of Germany. And obviously it's important that Germany has the shame and bears the shame for the victims and to make sure it happens again. But I would also argue it's dangerous in a way to do that, because let's remember, and hopefully you understand that from the research, many of these ideas came out of the liberal democracies of Britain and America. So thank you for your time, your forbearance on what is a difficult topic, and I have just one last thing to say. I would humbly ask the Denkmal if they would let me do the 2 other lectures, which is the second. The second one is on the application of all this research I did on what is happening before 1939, but also a lot of which I spent years on the research about the Nazis' use of poison gas, because as I was talking about in relation to the origins of Auschwitz-Birkenau, there are many new conclusions I've come to based on what I've learned. And the third lecture is even more important, in my opinion, is about the gas vans, because I spent a long time researching the engineering, the chemistry, the development, the history, as you've seen bits and pieces here, of the development of gas vans. Now, the gas vans are an interesting topic because there are no plans of the Nazi gas vans, etc. So basically it has become a cause célèbre for the deniers. They like to hang on to the gas vans as something that can be used to say the Holocaust didn't happen. Now I believe, based on all the research I've done, I can completely describe it from an engineering point of view, a chemical point of view, etc. So I will end there. Thank you for your time and forbearance.
Thanks, first of all, for your really interesting and challenging lecture. I would be interested how much, you said you can't present your whole research results, which is obvious for 1 hour. How much do you know about the real precise transfer of knowledge? You mentioned, for example, Karl Brandt, or one could think about the Saura van company who made these gas wagons for euthanasia, or in Serbia or Soviet Union. They built these cars. How much beneath the phenomenological parallel, which are really convincing and very, really touching to see this coming from the 19th century. How much do you know about or could you find out about the precise transfer of knowledge? Well, to whom did Karl Brandt refer when he, and so on?
What I would say, before 1914, people were living in a globalized world. Everything is reported in other countries. So what's happening in Britain is reported in Germany, what's happening in Germany is reported in Britain and America, etc., etc. So everybody knows what's going on, and the transfer of knowledge is great. You also have, for example, in science terms, the many British scientists, Fritz Haber, I think, knew after the First World War, the British went to investigate the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute to understand what they're doing on chemical weapons. Now, Fritz Haber knew some of the British scientists already from pre-war, because there was such a transfer of knowledge and expertise. Germans went to Britain, Britons went to Germany, etc., etc. So the transfer of knowledge prior to the First World War was great. And this is when communications are starting to take off.
And interwar times?
Okay, same. So for example, it's very interesting. Unfortunately, so far I've not been able to find a picture of the British gas vans they were using for testing gas masks in the German papers. But I will find one, because Britain invited Germany in the 30s to come and visit all of their chemical civil defense establishments to understand what they were doing. The Germans did the same. A British delegation went to Germany. They were showed, for example, one of the I can't remember the name, but the big German gas mask producers was based in Sachsenhausen. Auer, actually. There was a subcamp there, if I remember. So the British delegation came to Berlin, and they were taken to our facilities in Sachsenhausen, and they were shown the testing of gas masks and gas chambers. The transfer of knowledge was 100%. As I said, what I'd really like to find is a picture of the British gas vans, those 40 produced for testing gas masks, in one of the German publications. It must be there somewhere because, in Germany especially, the number of journals is unbelievable. They have journals on civil defense, poison gas, many things, and there are so many photographs, and all from Britain or America or Japan or Russia. So the transfer of knowledge is immense. Also, what I would say, you've got to remember in the 20s and 30s, there's this culture of gas. Everybody believes the next war will be a war of chemical weapons on civilian population. So there's a lot of investment in getting the civilian population ready, the emergency services. So guess what? They start building gas-proof vans for civil defense. So all of this stuff is interchangeable, the knowledge is interchangeable. What you will not find directly in the, for example, Karl Brandt's testimonies at Nuremberg or before Nuremberg, which actually are a travesty in my opinion, you will not find him directly linking himself to any of that.
I'm not into history too much. I'm a chemistry student. So that was also very interesting
Good,
for me
thank you.
From that point of view. I had a question because you mentioned very often that Richardson was very progressive,
Sure.
but like in the first place, he kind of invented the gas poisoning thing.
Yes.
And I think at that point, I really thought of like the responsibility of science in that way, because maybe especially when he heard of people thinking of killing criminals via his invention, maybe like he should have like taken the initiative to like maybe go. Did he do anything about like, did he stand up for like really prohibiting this use, because maybe he could have done something about it?
His technology that he had developed in poison gas for killing condemned prisoners. In fact, he was completely against capital punishment anyway, but he certainly didn't want his ideas and what he developed used for capital punishment. That is absolutely correct. But you must remember, and this is where, unfortunately, it's difficult to get this across, but I spent more than a year only looking at old newspapers. And unless you look at those old newspapers, you don't really get the feeling of what society is like there in terms of what they're thinking. I sort of give you a few ideas, like these pictures from Battersea of the gas chamber before and after. This is not seen as sensationalist. This is just a public discussion of what's going on. This is how they think at this time. Obviously, we think differently now, but you've got to put yourselves in the shoes of 19th century, Victorian England or America, etc., because it is a totally different mindset.
Yeah, I think you really pointed it out, and I really got the impression that you always tried to like protect Richardson a bit, because you mentioned very often how progressive he was and told like how a good person he was in the end.
Yes.
But still, like I think it's a question for responsibility in that.
I don't disagree, but how could he foresee the Nazis?
No, of course he couldn't. But still, like I asked myself.
And he was,
if
in some ways, you've got to say, he was being progressive, because the treatment of stray cats and dogs, it's not very pleasant for the stray cat and dog being beaten to death in the street with a club.
Yes, and it's probably just like too much to expect to like to think of him to like think of like potential applications.
Of course, but it's the paradox.
Publishing it.
I think what you say is absolutely correct, and I am totally in agreement with this. Scientists, progressives, whoever who invent things, they invent them for what they think is a good reason. What they don't expect and what they cannot envisage is when it's used for something else, which is actually what happened with the Nazis. They took methods and technologies and research and science that had been developed. Maybe we wouldn't call it progressive today, but it's certainly at the time it was seen as progressive, and it was used for something else. That is a book in itself, the morality of what science is used for, etc. I totally agree.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that contribution. It's, I think, a little bit revolutionary, because, for the last 15 years, we have a discussion whether Holocaust and genocide studies should start with the genocide against Herero and Nama, going to the Armenians, and then the old question of transferring those things to the Nazi decision-making process for the so-called final solution. So is this a fruitless discussion facing your findings, so that we can say it makes more sense to give the whole discussion more a direction of, going back to the invention of technical possibilities than exact genocidal studies? This is my first question. My second question is related to that. When in forthcoming times, the people look back from the 1950s to Fukushima, they will say, well, this is an age or an era of peaceful or not peaceful usage of nuclear energy. Yeah? Perhaps we forgot that the times from the invention of the steam engine until the Second World War, it was an era of gas.
Correct.
Because, the illumination of the cities in the nights, all the possibilities to use gas to benefit the people, who are ill in their lungs or things like that, You have gas as a, ubiquitäre possibility, to improve a modern society. And by the way, it's very interesting to see the state county commissioner for Litzmannstadt County. He defended himself when in Berlin a decision was made that 20,000 Jews from the West should be forcibly deported and settled into the Łódź ghetto. Yep. He said in the 1920s, we as National Socialists said, when a district is packed with too much people from the poorest class, then we have the Brutstätte of communism, the nucleus of communism. Sure. Yeah, and with this argument, he tried to defend himself, not to receive all these additional 20,000 Jews. So I think this is a very interesting, very small point in the whole picture, but it's, I think, worth mentioning.
Absolutely.
And the last thing is, you switched from killing the animals to killing people. Mercy kill and capital punishment. I think there is a step in between, and this is the usage of Tränengas against masses. Do you have any
tear gas?
Tear gas? Yeah. Do you have any findings of the invention and usage of tear gas against crowds?
First question is the most interesting one, because I did say in one of my conclusions, I think it is very dangerous to detach what happened in Nazi Germany, their ideology and their crimes, from history and treat it as some unique, one-off, never to be repeated event. So what the research I did told me was they were not detached from history. And when you do detach them from history, you get the wrong, or some wrong impressions of why, how it happened. And that for me is dangerous, because the key point for me was, I suspect if you went around Germany and asked some of the questions I asked, who invented gas chambers? Who used poison gas to kill people? I suspect 99% of people would say, we did. That sort of thing. And that, as well as being factually incorrect, is dangerous, because it comes back to the scientist saying, it's not as clean cut as that. Technology, methodology is developed in liberal democracies. Not in some fascism. This is, 19th century, it's Great Britain and America are the two great liberal democracies of the world. And even the ideology of the Nazi, most of it is not their own. They took ideology that was being developed in Great Britain and America, okay, nothing like what the Nazis did with it, but eugenics, the concept that the British are put on this earth to bring all these good things to all these different inferior peoples. All of these ideas are coming out of Britain, not out of Germany, out of Britain. And when Britain, it's also interesting, you read the American newspapers, right up till the 1890s, Britain is the mother country. By 1890, America's been independent for 120 years. But they still look to Britain for the ideas. Britain is seen as the center of ideas, modernity, new things, etc. So I think, and this is what I think my research shows, we need to look at the Nazis, what they did, etc., in a wider historical context, because I think it's very dangerous to treat it like it is. And too many historians, in my opinion, treat it almost as completely something separate. Nothing to do with the rest of history. It's unique, we need to study it as unique. And I think it's highly dangerous. Because, again, coming back to the science, if liberal democracies, not knowing what will be done with them, all the technology, all the ideas, eugenics was originally progressive. They didn't know what the Nazis would do with the ideas, but it is dangerous to cut that off from the history of what the Nazis were, their ideology, and their methods. It comes back to something I said, hydrocarbons are the power of the Industrial Revolution. No hydrocarbons? That's actually why the Industrial Revolution starts in Britain, 50 years before anywhere else. You could write a book on this, and there is books just on this, but it's hydrocarbons power the machinery that powers the Industrial Revolution. Side effect of burning hydrocarbons is carbon monoxide. And it's everywhere. Factories, homes, everywhere. Pollution in the cities, the lot. I agree. My opinion, it comes back again to what I say. I think the Nazis, the Holocaust, etc., have been detached, and they need to be reattached, because you cannot, in my opinion, understand, which is why I'd like to do the other two lectures, some of the ideas and what the Nazis did and the technology without understanding where it came from, in my opinion.
I'm kind of speechless because it's so much food for thought and so thought-provoking. Because what I'm thinking of basically, and it's not really a question because I cannot really pose a question, the interesting is the disuse of these inventions, that they are not used anymore. And the thing is that in the Second World War, there was no mass usage of gas against enemy soldiers, which is interesting because it was a very brutal war. They were using flamethrowers, they were killing each other in the worst methods, but they were not using gas, maybe because they thought it was dangerous. On the same time, the Nazis are obviously doing genocide by using gas in masses. And then, and this is an interesting question which you brought up with, about the scientists and their ethical problems, like Oppenheimer, who built the first atomic bomb. Afterwards, he was absolutely horrified by it and was almost looked upon as a communist in the 1950s in the McCarthy era because he was against using nuclear weapons. So the same thing happened after the Second World War. No one used nuclear weapons again, although they are full with nuclear weapons. Now is the first time that maybe they will be used. Yeah, so there's talk about it. And no one has used poison gas to commit genocide, although genocide has happened since then. So that's kind of interesting.
The Italians used gas against civilians in Abyssinia, Ethiopia now, and also the Japanese in China, not on a huge scale, but they used it. I think it was not used in the Second World War for a number of reasons. Each side had so much, it would be like nuclear standoff now. And also, you got to remember the horror of poison gas. I did mention it. After the First World War, people see this as completely barbaric, not human, shouldn't be using it. And I think these effects still go through to the 30s and then, the Second World War. And another point I'd add, I believe this is one of the reasons, amongst others, that the Nazis did not publicize the mercy killing program, because they were using poison gas. And by many Germans, this would have been seen as horrific and barbaric, because That's why Germany didn't adopt, for example, gas for capital punishment. I'll make one other point, very interesting. I've also looked at the British chemical weapons investigation reports from the Second World War. This is interesting. The British start reinvestigating, because they'd forgotten everything from the First World War, as you do. In 1941, they start investigating hydrogen cyanide as a chemical weapon. What do? They write to the British ambassador in America. What do they ask him for? Any investigative scientific reports on the use of hydrogen cyanide in capital punishment in America. So they're asking for the live data that the Americans have on them killing prisoners with hydrogen cyanide because they want to use it as a chemical weapon. So the crossovers are always there everywhere between all of these subjects. That's why I said all these subjects link together in one way or another.
Okay, then I think I'll wrap it up. A few last remarks. First of all, thank you, Cameron, for coming here and giving us this lecture. It's really thought-provoking. Thank you.